Hello, and thanks so much for joining me today. Many of you listening already know that I grew up here in Melbourne, Australia, where during the 70s we used to party like there was no tomorrow. The decade certainly was one of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new here, because if you're of the same vintage, I bet that's exactly what you were doing, no matter where you grew up. It was an era when live bands played all the time at schools, university campuses, town halls, and pubs. You could head out any night or day and catch a great show, and we definitely had our favourite bands to see. One of the ones that was on top of my list, like so many kids back then, was the band Skyhooks. These guys revolutionised the music scene in Australia with their catchy tunes, homegrown lyrics, and zany outfits and antics on stage. Depending on where you're tuning in from right now and how old you are, you may not know their songs, but I guarantee once I introduce you to them, you'll never forget them. Most of Skyhook's material was written by the band's founding member and bass guitarist Greg Macainsh, whom I have to tell you has required quite a bit of arm twisting before he'd agree to this chat. He does have some awesome stories to tell, though, so let's get right into it. What I know about you, Greg Macainsh, is that you grew up in Warrandyte, a suburb of Melbourne, and your father was a sometime poet while your mother was a librarian. And I guess that explains where you got the love of language and of writing from. Am I right?
Well, yes. I mean, I think in our household, it was you have to keep your mouth shut, but it was okay to express your thoughts on paper because my father was always writing or studying. So I learned that language was a thing.
And did you actually start writing down stuff yourself when you were very
Uh,
young?
yeah, well, at high school, I started writing stuff down because they had a subject called English literature, where you actually studied great writers. And I think our assignments were we had to write poetry and
Right.
short prose. And then, of course, in the 60s, I heard pop music and was fascinated by the lyrics. I had bands at high school, and a big part of my awareness.
When did you find out that you were pretty good at writing lyrics?
Well, I don't know if I've ever found that out, but
Oh, you're very modest, Greg.
yeah, I was in a few bands as a teenager and we did all the usual pop stuff. I was in a band called the Reuben Tice and they had a couple of original songs and I thought, yeah, maybe I could do this too.
It was really when you first heard the Beatles, like so many artists, that you became enraptured with music and decided to learn guitar?
Probably, yeah. I remember first hearing the Beatles when I was in the Boy Scouts at a jamboree, and then there was also the Rolling Stones. I gravitated a bit more towards that camp, when I was 13 or 14. Little Red Rooster sounded absolutely wild at the time. We thought, gosh, this is from another planet.
You dumped the Boy Scouts and took up music.
Yeah, that's kind of pretty accurate.
So you finish school. What happens then?
Well, this was in the era of the Vietnam War, and I was in the draft to be conscripted. So one just sat around sort of waiting because one's life could just
Turn on a dime. Yeah.
yeah, who knows what could have happened. So I worked in a farm for a year, and then I went to film and television college. During that time, I was still playing in bands, and around 1973, I put together another band with a guy called Steve Hill, who was a singer, and that became the first version of Skyhooks.
At the time, were you considering music as a full-time career or it was just a hobby?
No, I wasn't. But later on, I had to make that choice because Skyhooks started recording and we were becoming very popular. So I weighed up the two options and chose music.
Can you describe the music scene at the time? Because Melbourne was the capital of music in Australia, wasn't it?
It was hard for me to compare because I hadn't been out of Melbourne at that age. I really hadn't. But I did used to go to a lot of dances and so on when I was 16. So we'd all go to those. So I saw a lot of 60s bands like the Masters Apprentices, the Easy Beats, etc., etc. Some guys like to play football on the weekends. I played music. I was into songs, the equipment. Guys talk about their guitars, their amplifiers, and stuff. So it's just a hobby, I guess, that became a bit more.
Well, it
serious.
certainly became your life, didn't it?
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
And you omitted from that list of things that were around, you omitted the girls because teenage girls were a big part of the whole fanfare.
Yeah, well, we weren't sort of really focused on that so much. We were more concerned about what we were doing, and the audience sort of came second.
Right. So what were you doing? You formed this band Skyhooks. Where'd you get the name from?
That was just out of necessity because we'd rehearsed and we were at the stage of going out to play, and we didn't have a name. I had a little book where I used to collect band names. Anyway, we had a rehearsal and everyone was leaving. I said, "Look, we've got to have a name because they want to put it on a poster for this thing." And I said, "How about Skyhooks?" And they said, "Oh, that'll do." We weren't particularly fussy about it. So that's how it got picked. It was an imaginary object, like a skyhook. It's the thing you grab for when you're about to fall off the mountain. And it was in the same sort of grouping as a tin of striped paint, these things that didn't really exist but had a name for them. So that's where that came from.
Okay, so you start playing around Melbourne. You start getting attention from a whole lot of people, from a whole lot of fans, but also from one Ross Wilson.
Then after Daddy Cool, he had a band called Mighty Kong. Skyhooks got a gig supporting Ross's band, and so that's how he and I first met and sort of kept in contact. And then I signed a publishing deal with him, and he was motivated to get us recorded. And I think somebody brought Michael Gudinski down, and Molly, and Michael decided to put us on his record label, Mushroom, and Ross produced us. Yeah.
So what had you been playing when Ross saw you? Because this was prior to your first album. Had you written all of these songs already?
We were playing original songs and a couple of covers. The bulk of them ended up on Living in the 70s.
You had written most of the songs for that debut album, which we're now celebrating the 50th anniversary of, quite incredibly. What was your driving force? What was your inspiration in writing some of those songs? Can you walk us through some?
Well, I spent a lot of time listening to great songwriters, people like Bob Dylan. I was fascinated by the words and how they put them together. And I used to sit down and copy out Bob Dylan's lyrics just to see how it felt to write stuff like that on paper. Like a Rolling Stone, those songs which had lots and lots of verses in them. And I thought at some point, Bob must have sat down and written them out himself the first time. So I sort of copied doing that to see what it felt like and maybe get a sense of how he thought. And I did that with a few other people like Ray Davies, who wrote great songs for the Kinks. I'd play the guitar and get a sense of the mood and melody for what it was to become. Because when you're doing this, you're flying blind. You don't know exactly how it's going to end up. You have some idea, but quite often in the process, it becomes something else.
And it's not something that you can be academically taught, really, how to write a song, is it? It's trial and error, and you've got to have a feel for what you're doing. There are no rules around it particularly, are there?
No. I mean, well, pop songs are they've got a pretty set sort of structure. There's a verse, there's a chorus, there's the instrumental, there might be another bit. So that side of it is tried and tested, but actually what goes into it can be anything. And, generally they're 3.5, 4 minutes long. So you
for radio airplay, of course.
You have certain parameters that you have to fit it into.
What you became really well known for, Greg Macainsh, was becoming the first Australian rock band to really write songs in a local setting. A lot of these artists that you were perhaps studying were writing about the towns, the cities, the countries that they grew up in. And until you came along, there was nobody really writing about this country, Australia. What made you decide to bring it in local?
Well, I wanted to have the same kind of devices that people like Ray Davies or Bob Dylan or Chuck Berry had, where they could mention a place like Memphis, Tennessee, and in your mind you'd think, wow, that sounds mysterious and wonder what it's like there. It's that sense of place,
Right.
which you can do but in a few words. And I thought, well, can it be done here? Because, as you said, it wasn't a common thing. I'd heard a few place names in Slim Dusty songs, but in terms of sort of pop and rock, yeah, there was no sort of benchmark of what was cool and what wasn't. So I started looking around for place names of places, one, that I'd been to, and two, that had a bit of ethos and maybe mystique or a story about them. So if you mention Toorak, they'd have some idea, well, in Melbourne anyway, not anywhere else, of that place meant more than just a name on a street sign. Toorak is it's like, every city has their enclave of expensive houses, and you don't get to live there unless you're well off, and it attracts a certain type of people. So Toorak was maybe the equivalent of Beverly Hills if you were in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I don't know. I looked for other places as well that had some kind of cachet, and obviously I settled on Bourne, which at the time was a middle class suburb full of brick veneer houses and people at that kind of level of, social economic hierarchy. Yeah. And Carlton was sort of a place where there were lots of uni students. So we were aware of the different suburbs, Those places were the ones that passed muster in my mind. Of course, there's a million other suburbs around, but I didn't really know enough to be able to make a comment on them.
In some ways, you were quite a naive young man, weren't you? You hadn't travelled very much. You didn't look outside your home city of Melbourne,
Yeah.
never even considered Sydney or Brisbane or any of the other cities in Australia, let alone outside of here. And I guess quite by accident, you popularised Melbourne everywhere. You were a deep thinker, weren't you?
Yes. Well, I had an awareness that thinking was a thing to do, and but it's possibly my upbringing, but also the way people were taught at school then was to think about things and analyze things, and there wasn't as much sort of information as there is now. So you read books, perhaps talk to people, but also you would ponder certain things and wonder how they were or how they came into being. Yeah.
You weren't writing your average love song, were you? You were writing a whole lot of different subjects.
Love songs weren't a subject I was that good at, and also plenty of other people were writing love songs and doing it very well. And so I thought that there's got to be other topics apart from the usual, and I think that's what I sort of gravitated towards.
So did you intentionally set out to make the band look and sound and feel different from whatever else was out there? Because obviously that's what you managed to accomplish.
Well, yes. I mean, I was always going out to see bands, and they were good musicians. But I thought, visually or theatrically, they weren't that exciting, and I wanted to have something that was interesting visually and musically. So that sort of became the blueprint for Skyhooks, that we had to give some thought to how we appeared. But it wasn't, regimented. Nobody had to wear a uniform. It was just, the rule was, I guess, no blue jeans, and wear something that expresses a certain aspect of yourself. That became fun because people would source their own costumes and things to wear, and the other guys in the band wouldn't know. So when you'd turn up at the dressing room and you'd pull out something you were going to wear, everyone else went, wow, or that's awful, But so it became a bit of a game, and just evolved from there.
Skyhooks were renowned as much for their flamboyant costumes and makeup as they were for those novel, catchy songs that were intensely belted out by lead singer Graham Shirley Strawn.
I first met Graham, as we all knew him, up at Eltham, and he'd come up on the weekends and go to all the parties we had up there because it was a pretty interesting sort of scene. And I think Fred, our drummer, had met him at the Village Green Hotel, where they used to have Sunday afternoon sessions with bands. He was a really sort of gregarious, in-your-face, larrikin type of guy, but there was this other side to him where you could tell he wanted to sing, but he was kind of shy about it, I guess. So we heard him and I thought, he's pretty good. And so he joined Skyhooks.
Graham Strawn was an avid surfer, and his nickname Shirley was given to him by fellow surfers due to his long, sun-bleached and curly hair, referring to Shirley Temple. He was also a carpenter. Greg had utilised Shirley as a singer initially in his previous band called Frame, but when Skyhook's original singer left the band, Shirl took to the stage and blew everyone out of the water. He was a natural frontman, young and gifted, loud-mouthed and witty, blessed with a sweet yet powerful voice and androgynous good looks. Greg had told him he'd need to work the stage, and Shirl never looked back, strutting out front like a man possessed. Correct me if I'm wrong, this was before the group Kiss actually got started, wasn't it?
Yeah, before we were making records, we were certainly dressing up. Yeah, yes.
And Kiss wasn't around yet in America?
I was vaguely aware of Kiss. I think I'd seen them once on a TV show, but they didn't really register. I mean, the person that did register was Gary Glitter, who I'd seen several times, and his live show I was fascinated by, and it was really, really exciting. And the music complemented that. But Skyhooks was different in the sense that the songs were about specific things, more what I thought were interesting topics compared to someone like Gary Glitter or the other Sweet or the other sort of glam rock bands that were around at the time. Yeah,
you were very different to any of them, and I'm sorry for anybody who never had the opportunity to see you guys play live, because it was one hell of a show, both in terms of the way you guys dressed up and in terms of the music itself. You addressed teenage issues like buying drugs, like suburban sex, like the gay scene, like the loss of girlfriends, and as a result, many of the songs from that first Living in the 70s album were banned on commercial radio, which just made them all the more appealing, really, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was more of a concern to our record producer and record company, because they wanted stuff to be played on the radio, obviously. But it was a pretty extraordinary step in the Federation of Australian Recording Broadcasters to send out a letter saying these songs are not to be played and why they're not to be played because of certain lyrics and so on.
You had absolutely shocked conservative Australia, hadn't you? Everyone was just mouths open, agape, going, what has happened here? What has music become in this country, right?
Well, I guess so. We were sort of too busy to be concerned with what certain sections of the community might say, and we were just happy to be doing what we were doing and didn't really care if it wasn't accepted or anything.
Right. Well, I mean, some of them were incredibly controversial. Songs like You Just Like Me Because I'm Good in Bed. Come on, who is that written about for?
Yeah, like I'm going to tell you.
Damn.
But songs are sort of documentary, but you got the opportunity to extrapolate and embellish stories, and that's what makes them interesting. The real stories are pretty mundane and quite often boring, so you have to make them a bit more fun.
Greg Macainsh, I'm not sure that your life has actually been mundane and boring, but anyway, you said that you were too busy to be concerned with the reaction that you guys were getting. What do you mean too busy? Was there a lot of pressure on you from record companies to keep pushing out songs at that stage? Or?
Well, yeah, there was that, but we were also playing live a lot and touring, and you get up really early in the morning and catch a plane somewhere and do radio interviews and then play, and that was day after day activity. So it was, you didn't have lots of time to be relaxing or enjoying yourself. It was hard work.
So, for a guy who'd started off rather shy and naive, how did you feel about all this adoration that you were getting?
Well, it's unnatural and it's very uncomfortable at first, and I don't think anyone really ever gets used to it. And to get lots of attention for doing something that is fairly straightforward to yourself is weird, But there was a time where I couldn't go into the centre of Melbourne without being followed by people, which is awful.
Was it enjoyable overall?
Well, it was part of the job, and if you wanted to play music to lots of people and let the thing just go where it was going to go, and that's the thing with Skyhooks, it just took off and nobody could really stop it. So you've got to surf the wave or get back on the beach.
I like that. Well, it certainly exploded. I mean, Skyhooks didn't last all that long, but while you were riding that wave, you were at the height of heights for sure. The second single from Living in the 70s was Horror Movie. And that was kind of a commentary on the nightly news, which still seems so apt today, probably more apt today than it was even back then. Again, a sign of what a deep thinker you were. Can you tell us what your thought process was in putting that one together?
Well, one, the news, and I was very aware of the news because of the Vietnam era, and every night you'd hear about Australian guys that were killed in the jungles of Vietnam. So it was sort of part of the consciousness. I remember listening to a song by Frank Zappa called Trouble Coming Every Day, which sort of dealt with a similar theme. And I just must have come up with the lyrics and then wanted music that had that sort of ominous kind of feel to it. And that became the song.
And what a great song it is.
I was always aware that more stuff would be needed. So I was always jotting ideas down. And then when I had spare time, I'd make demos because I knew that we'd have to have stuff for subsequent albums. If I thought of a good idea or I saw something, is to write it down and keep it to work on later on. When we first started recording, we had no idea that anyone would take any notice of it for a start. So there's a bit more freedom, whereas later on you think, oh gosh, is this suitable? Will people like this? There's all those thoughts, and you just got to keep on doing it.
Your follow-up album, Greg Macainsh, was Ego Is Not a Dirty Word. I love that song. And I wonder if you still think today, 50 years later, that ego is not a dirty word.
Yeah, I mean, when we were sort of recording that, people said, oh, the kids, they won't know what ego means. I think I might have said, well, they'll find out. But it was really a comment on being confident, I guess. We had to give that illusion that we knew what we were doing and we were on top of the situation. And the line says, if I did not have an ego, I would not be here tonight. And that's true, because I'd seen many other musicians who were very good, but they didn't follow it through, or they were put off by criticism. And even though Skyhooks were popular, there was certainly a lot of criticism as well. And you had to learn to deal with that. So I think the song is a reaction to that.
What sort of criticism did you get?
Oh, some people said the lyrics were trite, we looked ridiculous, etc., etc. So part of that might have been envy, but it doesn't matter if you're on the receiving end of it. It has an effect.
Greg, tell me what happened when you started to tour America, because that didn't turn out quite the way you'd hoped it would, did it?
Well, I don't think we really hoped for anything apart from going there and playing and to see what it was like. And I always say to people, well, we had the choice to go to England, but I didn't want to go to England because all the Australian bands that went to England were all criticised by the press, and whereas America, I thought was a much more interesting place. I wanted to go there myself, and we toured there for 5 months or something and made an album there. But I never expected Americans would to get into it in the same way Australians did, because we were inherently an Australian group.
Because they didn't understand the local
Well,
references.
yeah, there's that, the look, and it's incredibly different culture. Even though we speak the same language, they use it totally differently,
Yeah.
as we do.
That was 1976, and you kind of broke up sometime later. Shirley Strawn started to put out his own solo records. Why did he want to do that?
I think he just wanted to do something where he had some personal input into it. He wanted to see how it would work.
Right. So in 78, your next single was Women in Uniform, which was also a smash hit.
Well, Red had left the band in early 1977, and he was replaced by a guy called Bob Spencer, and we wanted to do another album, which we did.
What was your inspiration for that one, Greg?
While I always tell the story of being, in Atlanta, or I think it was, and they had women security guards who used to swagger around the shopping centre with guns and handcuffs and so on. It was something I'd never seen in Australia. I thought, wow, that's a very interesting juxtaposition of femininity and power. So I started looking for similar kind of metaphors, and that put them together, and that became the song.
By the time we get to the turn of the decade in 1980, the band announces it's going to break up.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, Shirley left in 1978. He wanted to do other things, and he certainly did that. He and Red had been sort of introduced to television by our television appearances, and I think there was something in the world of TV that kind of appealed to them, and that's pretty obvious given that Shirley had his own TV show. It became more difficult on the road, and economically it made sense to stop.
Were you disappointed?
No, it sort of run its course. To actually stop being in that world for a lengthy period was really a good thing.
So how did you look toward the future?
I didn't look towards the future. Used to living day to day, so the future is not really a concern. And I tend to think things take care of themselves. Opportunities present themselves, and there's more to life than playing music.
And yet, in saying that, the demand for the classic lineup was still so strong. You did come back together in 83, and in 1990, I think it was the first time you recorded new material, which included the song Jukebox in Siberia.
Yeah. Well, we'd done a couple of reunions because there was interest in it, and Cheryl came to me and said, I really want to go out on the road again. And I'd been playing with John Farnham in 1986, 87, and I said to Cheryl, look, it'll be a lot of fun and it'll work. So then we thought perhaps we should record a bit new material. So we did a couple of songs, of which Jukebox in Siberia was one, and that surprisingly got to the top of the charts. I don't think anyone thought that was going to happen, but it did.
Had you been writing in the interim?
Yeah. Well, it sort of became a habit, and you can't stop ideas coming to you. They just do.
So would it be fair to say that you've got a whole lot of notes still stashed away somewhere that could be great songs to be recorded sometime in the future?
Yes. I mean, I haven't burnt my notebooks. Some people do, but no, I do have a collection of thoughts, yeah.
So it may not be the last time we see Greg Macainsh. I know from personal experience how difficult it was to get you to interview now, and it's only on the basis of the 50th anniversary of that very first album. But The original members of Skyhooks haven't had a whole lot of luck since then. Of course, Shirley Strawn was killed in an air crash in August of 2001. Peter Starkey died of complications after a fall in 2020. And now we've had Bob Starkey with a terminal illness diagnosis. So it will be getting harder to see any kind of original lineup come together again. We're not 20 years old anymore, are we?
No, and it's a great thing to do with when you're young. I'm not sure as one gets older. I know people do it, but touring is really physically demanding, and you've got to be in the right frame of mind to do that. So I just think it's a natural thing that one tends to slow down. And also, the music business is pretty one dimensional. And if you've got other thoughts of things you'd like to do, you should definitely go and do them. Yeah, you only get one shot at it. So you might as well, no one expects you to be in a pop group that you were in when you were 21 for the rest of your life.
Oh, you've certainly managed to reinvent yourself several times over, haven't you? You did study to be a lawyer and
Yeah.
toss that in a little bit too. So you've had lots of different starts and goes. Is there anything left on your bucket list?
Probably, but I'll see something that I want to do and I'll do it. But like I said earlier on, I don't spend a lot of time planning the future because it's not for us to know.
Greg Macainsh, which song would you like us to go out on here?
Hey, what's the matter? That was a song that on Living in the 70s, it was almost a throwaway song, but lots of people say they love it. I mean, it's got hardly any lyrics and it's incredibly simple, but it was always a lot of fun to play. And I think the audience picked up on that too. Yeah.
The album was remastered by David Briggs, a former member of the Little River Band. Greg Macainsh, congratulations on a fabulous career, and thank you from each one of us who grew up living in the 70s here in Australia and beyond for the awesome music that you've given us. We wouldn't be the same had you not given us this music.
Thank you. Thank you.